You can look at glass or through glass. Light can pass through glass, yet glass can also obscure what is behind it. Objects, to be perceived, must first penetrate in some manner our brain, but we are not locked with our senses. Although normal consciousness is focused on the senses and is usually restricted to them, it is possible for man to pass through his sense fixation into any imaginal structure which he conceives and so fully occupies it that it is more alive and more responsive than that on which his senses fixed his eyes. If this were not true, man would be an automaton reflecting life, never affecting it. Man, who is all imagination, is not tenant to the brain, but landlord. He need not rest content with the appearance of things. He can go beyond senses to conceptual awareness. This ability, to pass through the mechanical reflective structure of the senses, is the most important discovery man can make. It reveals man as a center of creation with powers of intervention which enable him to alter the course of events through a series of mental transformations in himself. Attention, the spearhead of imagining, may be either from without as his senses fixed his eye or directed from within, if he pleases, and through the senses pass into the wish fulfilled. To move from sense awareness, or things as they seem, to conceptual awareness, or things as they ought to be, we imagine as vivid and as lifelike a representation as possible of what we would see, hear, and do, were we physically present, and physically experiencing things as they ought to be and imaginatively participate in that scene. The following story tells of one who went through the glass and broke the chains that bound her. 2 years ago I was taken to the hospital with a serious blood clot condition which apparently had affected the entire vascular system, causing hardening of arteries and arthritis. A nerve in my head was damaged and my thyroid enlarged. Doctors could not agree on the cause of this condition, and all their treatments were completely ineffective. I was forced to give up my every enjoyable activity and remain in bed most of the time. My body, from hips to toes, felt as though it was encased and bound by tight wires, and I couldn't put my feet on the floor without wearing heavy hip-length elastic stockings. I knew something of your teaching and tried very hard to apply what I had heard. But as my condition grew worse and I could no longer attend any of your lectures, my despondency grew deeper. One day a friend sent me a postcard picturing the scene of a lovely beach by the ocean. The picture was so beautiful. I looked and looked at it and began to remember past summer days at the seashore with my parents. For a moment, the postcard picture seemed to become animated, and flooding memories of myself running free on the beach filled my mind. I felt the impact of my bare feet against the hard wet sand. I felt the icy water running over my toes and heard the crash of waves breaking on shore. This imaginal activity was so satisfying to me as I lay in bed that I continued to imagine this wonderful scene, day after day, for about 1 week. One morning I moved from my bed to a couch, and because of the excruciating pain my entire body became paralyzed. I could neither sit up nor lie down. This terrible pain lasted for more than a full minute, but when it stopped, I was free. It seemed as if all the wires binding my legs had been cut. One moment I was bound, the next moment I was free. Not by degrees, but instantly. We walk by faith, not by sight. When we walk by sight, we know our way by objects which our eyes see. When we walk by faith, we order our life by scenes and actions which only imagination sees. Man perceives by the eye of imagination or by sense. But two mental attitudes to perception are possible: the creative imaginative effort which meets with an imaginative response, or the unimaginative fixing of the eye, which merely reflects. Man has within him the principle of life and the principle of death. One is the imagination building its imaginal structures out of the generous dreams of fancy. The other is the imagination building its imaginal structures from images reflected by the chill wind of fact. One creates. the other perpetuates. Man must adopt either the way of faith or the way of sight. To the extent that man builds from dreams of fancy, he is alive, and therefore, the development of the faculty to pass through the reflective glass of the senses is an increase of life. Restricting the imagination, by staying the eye on the reflective glass of the senses, is a reduction of life. The specious surface of fact reflects rather than discloses, deflecting the eye of imagination from the truth that sets man free. The eye of imagination, if not deflected, looks on what ought to be there, not what is. However familiar the scene on which sight rests, the eye of imagination could gaze on one never before witnessed. It is only this eye of imagination that can free us from the sense fixation of outer things which completely dominates our ordinary existence, and keeps us looking on the reflective glass of facts. It is possible to pass from thinking of, to thinking from. Experiencing the state, for that experience means unification, whereas in thinking of, there is always subject and object, the thinking individual and the thing thought of. Self-abandonment. That is the secret. We have to abandon ourselves to the state, in our love for that state, and live the life of that state, and no more our present state. Imagination seizes upon the life of that state, and gives itself to the expression of that life. Faith plus love is self-commission. We can't commit ourselves to what we do not love. Never would you have made anything if you had not loved it. Never would you have made anything if you hated it. And to make the state alive, one must become it. God loved man, his created, and became man in faith that this act of self-commission would transform the created into the creative. We must be and commit ourselves to what we love, as God who loved us committed himself to us. We must be the state to experience the state. The center of conscious imagining can be shifted, and what are now mere wishes, brought into penetrative focus and entered. Entrance commits us to the state. The possibilities of such shifting of the center of imagining are startling. The shifting of the center of imagining is not brought about by spatial travel, but by a change in what we are aware of. The boundary of the world of sense is a subjective barrier. So long as the senses take notice, the eye of imagination is deflected from the truth. We do not get far unless we let go. Not facts, but dreams of fancy shape our lives. In the world of sense we see what we have to see, in the world of imagination we see what we want to see. And by seeing it with eye of imagination, we create it for the world of sense to see. We see the outer world automatically. Seeing what we want to see demands voluntary and conscious imaginative effort. Common sense assures us that we are living in a solid and sensible world, but this so seemingly solid world is in reality imaginal through and through. Man is all imagination. Therefore, a man must be where he is in imagination, for his imagination is himself. Imagination is active at and through any state that it is aware of. If we take shifting of awareness seriously, there are possibilities beyond belief. The senses join man in forced and unholy wedlock to what, were he imaginatively awake, he would put asunder. We need not feed on sense data. Shift the focus of awareness and see what happens. However little we move mentally, we should perceive the world under a slightly changed aspect. Awareness can be moved by a change in what we are aware of. Man is manifesting the power of imagination whose limits he cannot define. To realize that the real self is not something enclosed within the spatial boundary of the body is most important. It hardly ever crosses our minds that this world might be different in essence from what common sense tells us. This looking through the eye not only shifts consciousness to other parts of this world but to other worlds as well. Astronomers must wish they knew more of this looking through the eye, this mental traveling that mystics practice so easily. Mental traveling has been practiced by awakened men and women since the earliest days. Paul states, I know a man in God who 14 years ago was caught up to the third heaven. Whether in the body or out of the body I do not know, God knows. Paul is telling us that he is that man and that he traveled by the power of imagination or God. In his next letter to the Corinthians, he writes, "Test yourselves. Do you not realize that God is in you? We need not be dead in order to enjoy spiritual privileges. Test yourselves today." The range of imagining is such that no one knows what limits, if any, there are to its ability to create reality. All these stories show us one thing, that an imaginal activity implying the wish fulfilled must start in the imagination apart from the evidence of the senses, in that journey that leads to the realization of desire. It is our wish and our blessing that things you never thought possible will happen to you. To support us, please subscribe the channel, Rumi Sufi Mystic, and press the like button.